Number 1. Dr. Harold Shipman, the physician who became Britain's most prolific serial killer. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, into a working-class family that placed enormous value on education and social advancement. His mother, Vera, doted on him, often telling young Harold that he was special and destined for greatness, a message that seemed to take root deeply in his psyche. Shipman excelled academically and pursued medicine at Leeds School of Medicine, graduating in 1970 and beginning what appeared to be a promising career as a general practitioner. He married Primrose May Oxtoby in 1966, and together they had 4 children, presenting the image of a stable, respectable family man dedicated to serving his community. Shipman's early career seemed unremarkable until 1975, when he was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, a powerful painkiller to which he had become addicted. He was fined, attended a drug rehabilitation program, and remarkably was allowed to continue practicing medicine, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. By 1977, Shipman had joined the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, Greater Manchester, where he quickly built a reputation as a dedicated, hardworking doctor who made house calls and seemed genuinely concerned about his elderly patients. What his patients and colleagues did not know was that behind this benevolent facade, Shipman had begun a systematic campaign of murder that would span more than 2 decades. His method was chillingly simple and exploited the trust inherent in the doctor-patient relationship. Shipman would visit elderly patients, often women living alone, inject them with lethal doses of gemorphine, commonly known as heroin, and then sit with them as they died, sometimes even comforting them in their final moments. He would then falsify medical records to indicate that the patient had been in declining health, making the death appear natural and expected. The sheer audacity of his crimes was matched only by their frequency. Shipman killed with a regularity that suggested compulsion rather than calculation, sometimes murdering multiple patients within days of each other. His victim count eventually reached at least 215 confirmed murders, though some investigators believe the true number may exceed 250, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. The beginning of Shipman's downfall came in March 1998, when he murdered Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde. Unlike his previous victims, Grundy was active, healthy, and had no history of serious illness, making her sudden death immediately suspicious to her daughter, Angela Woodruff, who was a solicitor. Woodruff's suspicions deepened when she learned that her mother's will had been recently changed to leave nearly £400,000 to Shipman, cutting out Grundy's family entirely. The will was clumsily forged, typed on an old typewriter and witnessed by 2 of Shipman's patients who were friends with each other, a highly irregular arrangement. Woodruff contacted the police, and Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles of Greater Manchester Police began an investigation. When Grundy's body was exhumed, toxicology tests revealed a lethal level of morphine in her system, far more than would be present even if she had been a long-term user of the drug. This discovery prompted investigators to look more closely at other deaths among Shipman's patients, and a disturbing pattern quickly emerged. A statistical analysis of death certificates showed that Shipman's patients were dying at a rate significantly higher than those of other doctors in the area, and many of these deaths occurred shortly after Shipman had visited the patient alone. As investigators exhumed more bodies, they found the same telltale signs: high levels of morphine and no medical justification for its administration. The police discovered that Shipman had been stockpiling gemorphine, extracting it from patients who had legitimately been prescribed it before they died, and then using these supplies to kill other patients. Shipman's trial began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court, charged with the murder of 15 patients and 1 count of forgery related to Kathleen Grundy's will. The prosecution, led by Richard Henriquez QC, presented overwhelming evidence of Shipman's guilt, including forensic evidence, statistical analysis of death rates, testimony from relatives who described how their loved ones had been in good health before Shipman's visits, and expert testimony about the falsified medical records. Shipman's defense was weak and unconvincing. He maintained his innocence throughout, claiming that his patients had died of natural causes and that he had been a caring, dedicated physician. His arrogance was evident in the courtroom. He showed no remorse and seemed unable to grasp the magnitude of his crimes or the suffering he had caused. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 15 counts of murder and the forgery charge. On January 31, 2000, Mr. Justice Forbes sentenced Shipman to life imprisonment on each count of murder, recommending that he never be released. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated that Shipman had violated the trust placed in him as a doctor in the most heinous way imaginable, and that his crimes were so terrible that a whole life tariff was the only appropriate sentence. Following his conviction, a public inquiry was established under Dame Janet Smith to investigate the full extent of Shipman's crimes. The inquiry, which published its findings in 6 reports between 2002 and 2005, concluded that Shipman had killed approximately 215 patients between 1975 and 1998, though the actual number could be as high as 260. The inquiry also examined systemic failures that had allowed Shipman to kill for so long without detection, including inadequate monitoring of doctors' prescribing practices, lack of oversight of death certification, and a culture within the medical profession that was too trusting and resistant to questioning colleagues. The inquiry's recommendations led to significant reforms in British medical practice, including changes to the death certification process, enhanced monitoring of controlled drugs, and stricter oversight of general practitioners. Shipman never showed any remorse for his crimes and never explained his motives, maintaining his innocence even in prison. On January 13, 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, Shipman hanged himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison, robbing his victims' families of any chance of understanding why he had committed such monstrous acts. His suicide also meant that his widow would receive a pension and lump sum, as he had died before the age of 60, though later legal changes closed this loophole. The case of Harold Shipman remains a watershed moment in British criminal history and in the medical profession worldwide, demonstrating how even those in the most trusted positions can abuse their power in the most horrific ways and highlighting the critical importance of oversight, accountability, and questioning authority when something seems wrong. Number 2. Dr. Michael Swango, the American physician who poisoned patients and colleagues across multiple states and countries. Michael Joseph Swango was born on October 21, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington, to a military family that valued discipline and achievement. His father, Muriel Swango, was a career U.S. Army officer who served in the Vietnam War, and his mother, Muriel, worked as a schoolteacher. The family moved frequently due to his father's military assignments, and young Michael struggled to form lasting friendships, instead developing a fascination with death, disasters, and violence that would persist throughout his life. Despite showing disturbing tendencies even as a teenager, including keeping scrapbooks of car accidents and natural disasters, Swango excelled academically and gained admission to Quincy College in Illinois, where he majored in chemistry. He went on to attend Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, graduating in 1983, though his time in medical school was marked by troubling behavior that his instructors and fellow students noticed but failed to adequately address. Swango was known for performing poorly in his clinical rotations, showing a disturbing eagerness to be present when patients were coding or dying, and he earned the nickname Dr. Death from his classmates. Despite these red flags, he was allowed to graduate and began his medical internship at Ohio State University Medical Center in Columbus in 1983. It was during this internship that Swango's murderous activities began in earnest. Nurses and staff noticed an alarming pattern. Patients under Swango's care frequently suffered unexpected complications, respiratory arrests, and sudden deaths that had no clear medical explanation. Patients who had been stable would rapidly deteriorate after Swango administered medication or treatment, and the death rate on his rotation was significantly higher than normal. Nurses became so concerned that they began watching him carefully and documenting the pattern of deaths associated with his shifts. An investigation was launched by the hospital, and while they found the pattern suspicious, they lacked definitive proof of wrongdoing. Rather than risk legal action or a drawn-out investigation, Ohio State administrators decided to quietly dismiss Swango from the program in 1984, providing him with neutral references that failed to mention the suspicious circumstances of his departure. This decision allowed Swango to continue his deadly career elsewhere, a pattern that would repeat itself multiple times as institutions prioritized avoiding liability over protecting the public. Unable to secure another medical residency due to informal warnings that had circulated within the medical community, Swango took a job as a paramedic in Quincy, Illinois, in 1985. Even in this role, he found ways to harm others, poisoning several colleagues with arsenic-laced donuts and other food items, apparently enjoying the power of making people sick and watching them suffer. His co-workers began falling mysteriously ill with similar symptoms including severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea, all shortly after consuming food or drinks that Swango had provided. One paramedic, suspicious of the pattern, collected samples of food that Swango had brought and had them tested, revealing the presence of arsenic. Police searched Swango's apartment and found poisons, books about poisons and murder, and more disturbing scrapbooks filled with images of death and destruction. Swango was arrested and charged with battery for poisoning his colleagues. In 1985, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, serving only 2 years before being released on parole in 1987. Astonishingly, even with a criminal conviction for poisoning, Swango was determined to return to medicine, and he changed his name and falsified his credentials to achieve this goal. After his release, he worked briefly at a children's psychiatric facility in Virginia, but was soon dismissed when his criminal background was discovered. He then moved to South Dakota, where he obtained a job at the South Dakota State Penitentiary as a physician, but again his past caught up with him and he was fired. In 1991, Swango managed to secure a residency position in internal medicine at the University of South Dakota School of Medicine by omitting his criminal history and providing false information on his application. He completed this residency in 1993, once again leaving a trail of suspicious patient deaths that administrators noticed but failed to adequately investigate or report to authorities. Using forged documents and false credentials, Swango then obtained medical licenses and positions at hospitals in several states and even internationally. From 1994 to 1997, he worked at various facilities including the State University of New York at Stony Brook, the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York, and hospitals in Zimbabwe and Zambia in Africa. At each location, the same deadly pattern emerged. Patients died unexpectedly, often shortly after Swango had administered medication, and colleagues noticed his unusual interest in patient deaths and emergencies. In Zimbabwe, working at Nene Hospital and Pilo Hospital, Swango continued poisoning patients, and several suspicious deaths occurred during his tenure. However, investigations in Zimbabwe were hampered by limited resources and documentation, and Swango was able to leave the country before facing serious scrutiny. By 1997, authorities in the United States had finally begun to piece together the full scope of Swango's crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The FBI and local law enforcement agencies coordinated their investigations, tracking his movements and gathering evidence from the numerous hospitals and facilities where he had worked. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained evidence that Swango had falsified documents to obtain his position in Zimbabwe, a federal crime that gave them grounds to arrest him. On June 27, 1997, Swango was arrested at Chicago O'Hare International Airport as he was returning from Zimbabwe. He was initially charged with making false statements to obtain a visa, a charge that would hold him while investigators built their murder case. While in custody, the FBI worked tirelessly to gather evidence linking Swango to specific patient deaths, interviewing witnesses, reviewing medical records, and consulting with medical experts. The investigation revealed that Swango had likely killed dozens of patients throughout his career, though proving each case beyond a reasonable doubt was challenging due to the time that had passed, lack of tissue samples for toxicology, and the difficulty of distinguishing between malpractice and murder. In 1998, prosecutors were able to bring charges related to 3 murders of patients at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in New York, where Swango had injected patients with lethal substances. The evidence included witness testimony from nurses who had seen Swango behaving suspiciously around these patients, medical records showing unexplained changes in the patient's conditions immediately after Swango's interventions, and expert testimony about the likelihood that these deaths were the result of deliberate poisoning. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy trial that would expose the full extent of his crimes, Swango accepted a plea deal. On September 6, 2000, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and 1 count of making false statements. In his allocution, Swango admitted to killing the 3 patients by injecting them with lethal doses of potassium and other substances, though he showed little emotion and provided no explanation for why he had committed these horrific acts. On July 11, 2000, Judge Jacob Mishler of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York sentenced Swango to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would die in prison. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Mishler stated that Swango had betrayed the trust that patients place in physicians and had used his medical knowledge not to heal but to kill, making him one of the most dangerous individuals he had ever encountered. Swango is currently incarcerated at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, where he will remain for the rest of his life. The full extent of his murders may never be known, with estimates ranging from 35 to 60 victims across multiple countries, making him one of America's most prolific medical serial killers. His case led to significant reforms in medical credentialing, background checks for healthcare professionals, and reporting requirements for suspicious deaths in hospitals, highlighting the catastrophic consequences when institutions fail to properly vet healthcare workers or report concerning patterns of patient deaths. Number 3. Dr. Farid Fata, the oncologist who diagnosed healthy patients with cancer to profit from unnecessary chemotherapy. Farid Fata was born in 1965 in Lebanon and immigrated to the United States to pursue his medical education and career. He completed his medical training in hematology and oncology, specializing in the treatment of blood disorders and cancer, and established himself as a successful physician in the Detroit, Michigan area. By the early 2000s, Fata had built a thriving practice with multiple offices throughout the region, including the Michigan Hematology Oncology Centers, which served hundreds of patients seeking treatment for cancer and blood diseases. To his patients and the community, Fata appeared to be a dedicated, caring physician who went above and beyond for those facing life-threatening illnesses. He cultivated an image of a doctor who would fight tirelessly for his patients, offering hope even in the most difficult cases. Patients trusted him implicitly, often bringing him gifts, cards, and expressions of gratitude for his care. What they did not know was that behind this compassionate facade, Fata was operating one of the most monstrous medical fraud schemes in American history, a conspiracy that involved deliberately misdiagnosing healthy people with cancer and subjecting actual cancer patients to unnecessary, harmful, and excessive treatments purely to maximize his profits from insurance reimbursements. Fata's scheme was comprehensive and systematic. He would review test results and either misinterpret them or outright lie to patients about their diagnosis, telling healthy individuals that they had cancer when they did not, or telling patients with minor, manageable conditions that they had aggressive, life-threatening cancers requiring immediate intensive treatment. He then subjected these patients to brutal chemotherapy regimens, powerful cancer drugs that ravaged their bodies, destroyed their immune systems, caused severe side effects including nausea, hair loss, organ damage, and left them physically and emotionally devastated. For patients who actually had cancer, Fata would prescribe excessive amounts of chemotherapy far beyond what was medically appropriate, continuing treatment long after it was necessary or beneficial, keeping patients on toxic drugs even when their cancer was in remission or had been cured. His motivation was purely financial. Cancer treatment, particularly chemotherapy, is extraordinarily expensive, and insurance companies including Medicare and Medicaid pay substantial sums for these treatments. Each chemotherapy session, each cancer drug prescribed, each supportive medication to manage side effects represented thousands of dollars in revenue for Fata's practice. By keeping patients in treatment unnecessarily, he was able to bill insurance companies for millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. Fata also operated multiple facilities and employed other physicians, creating a network that maximized his ability to see patients and administer treatments, all while maintaining the veneer of a legitimate, patient-focused practice. The scale of his fraud was staggering. Over the course of approximately 7 years, from 2009 to 2013, Fata saw more than 1,200 patients and administered over 9,000 chemotherapy infusions, many of which were medically unnecessary. He billed Medicare alone for more than $150 million in fraudulent claims, personally profiting tens of millions of dollars that he used to fund a lavish lifestyle including expensive cars, luxury homes, and international travel. The suffering he caused was immeasurable. Patients endured months or years of brutal chemotherapy treatments that they did not need, experiencing excruciating side effects, permanent health damage, psychological trauma from believing they were dying of cancer, and in some cases, actual death from the treatments themselves or from complications arising from their unnecessarily weakened immune systems. Family members watched their loved ones deteriorate, spent their savings on treatments, and grieved for diagnoses that were false. The scheme began to unravel in 2013 when one of Fata's staff members, a medical assistant named George Kevorkian, became deeply troubled by what he was witnessing in the practice. Kevorkian noticed that patients who appeared healthy were being told they had cancer, that test results did not seem to support the diagnoses Fata was giving, and that treatments were continuing long after they should have stopped. Unable to reconcile what he was seeing with his understanding of ethical medical practice, Kevorkian went to the FBI with his concerns, providing detailed information about Fata's practices and pointing investigators toward specific patients and cases they should examine. The FBI launched a comprehensive investigation, working with medical experts to review patient files, compare Fata's diagnoses and treatment plans against established medical standards, and interview patients and their families. What they discovered was horrifying. In case after case, they found that Fata had lied about diagnoses, prescribed unnecessary treatments, and continued chemotherapy when it was medically contraindicated. Expert oncologists reviewing the files were shocked by the blatant disregard for patient welfare and the systematic nature of the fraud. The investigation also revealed that Fata had manipulated and intimidated his staff, creating an environment where employees were afraid to question his decisions or report their concerns. On August 6, 2013, federal agents arrested Farid Fata at his home, and he was charged with multiple counts of healthcare fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The criminal complaint detailed numerous specific cases of patients who had been misdiagnosed or overtreated, and the government alleged that Fata had knowingly and intentionally defrauded Medicare and private insurance companies while causing severe harm to his patients. As the investigation continued, more patients came forward with their stories, and the full scope of Fata's crimes became clear. The case drew national attention as one of the most egregious examples of medical fraud and patient abuse in American history. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Fata pleaded guilty on September 16, 2014, to 16 criminal counts including conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and money laundering. In his plea agreement, he admitted to intentionally misdiagnosing patients and administering unnecessary treatments for financial gain, acknowledging that he had violated his oath as a physician and betrayed the trust of his patients. During the sentencing phase, the court heard powerful victim impact statements from patients and their families. Patient after patient came forward to describe the physical and emotional devastation Fata had caused, including Monica Flagg, who testified about being told she had an aggressive form of cancer and enduring years of unnecessary chemotherapy that left her body permanently damaged, only to later discover that she had never had cancer at all. Other patients described watching their loved ones suffer and die from treatments that were not needed, the financial ruin that came from paying for expensive care, and the psychological trauma of living under a false death sentence. The government presented evidence that Fata had billed Medicare for more than $34 million in fraudulent claims and had administered approximately 9,000 unnecessary chemotherapy infusions to over 500 patients. On July 10, 2015, Judge Paul Borman of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan sentenced Farid Fata to 45 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed for healthcare fraud. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Borman stated that Fata's crimes were a horrific betrayal of the doctor-patient relationship, that he had treated his patients as profit centers rather than human beings, and that his actions had caused suffering that was almost incomprehensible. The judge emphasized that Fata's victims trusted him with their lives and their health, and he had violated that trust in the most cruel and calculated way imaginable for personal financial gain. Fata showed little remorse during the proceedings, offering only a brief apology that many victims and observers found insincere and inadequate. At 50 years old at the time of sentencing, and with a 45-year sentence, Fata will be 95 years old before he is eligible for release, effectively ensuring he will die in prison. He is currently incarcerated at a federal prison and will remain there for the rest of his natural life. The victims of Fata's crimes continued to suffer long after his conviction. Many of the patients who received unnecessary chemotherapy experienced permanent health problems including heart damage, kidney failure, neuropathy, and compromised immune systems. The psychological impact was equally devastating, with many patients struggling with PTSD, depression, and anxiety related to their experiences. In addition to the criminal case, hundreds of Fata's victims filed civil lawsuits seeking compensation for their suffering, and in 2019, a settlement fund of approximately $23 million was established to compensate victims, though many felt that no amount of money could truly make them whole after what they had endured. The case led to increased scrutiny of oncology practices, calls for better oversight of chemotherapy administration, and discussions about how to prevent similar abuses in the future, though many advocates argue that more needs to be done to protect patients from physicians who prioritize profit over care. Number 4. Dr. Larry Nassar, the osteopathic physician who sexually abused hundreds of young gymnasts under the guise of medical treatment. Lawrence Gerard Nassar was born on August 16, 1963, in Farmington Hills, Michigan, into a middle-class family. He pursued a career in medicine with a focus on sports medicine and osteopathy, earning his degree from Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine in 1993. Nassar developed an expertise in treating athletes, particularly young female gymnasts, and built a prestigious career that saw him work as the national team doctor for USA Gymnastics for nearly 2 decades and as an osteopathic physician at Michigan State University's Sports Medicine Clinic. To the outside world, Nassar appeared to be a dedicated, skilled physician who was passionate about helping young athletes achieve their dreams. Parents trusted him with their daughters, coaches praised his dedication and availability, and athletes were told they were fortunate to receive treatment from such a renowned specialist. Nassar cultivated this image carefully, making himself accessible to athletes at all hours, treating them for free or at reduced costs, giving them gifts and attention, and positioning himself as a caring mentor figure who understood the pressures and demands they faced. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, Nassar was a sexual predator who used his position of authority, his medical credentials, and his reputation to sexually abuse hundreds of young girls and women over a period spanning more than 2 decades. His method of abuse was particularly insidious because he disguised it as legitimate medical treatment. Nassar developed what he claimed was a specialized osteopathic technique for treating various athletic injuries, particularly those affecting the pelvic region, which involved inserting his ungloved fingers into patients' vaginas and rectums. He told athletes, many of whom were children or teenagers with no medical knowledge and who trusted doctors implicitly, that this was a necessary medical procedure that would help with their injuries or performance. He performed these assaults in examining rooms, sometimes with parents present in the room but positioned so they could not see what Nassar was doing, in his basement clinic at his home, in athletic training facilities at competitions, and even in hotel rooms during national and international gymnastics events. The abuse was systematic and widespread, affecting hundreds of victims across multiple institutions and settings over more than 20 years. Nassar's victims included Olympic gold medalists, national team members, college athletes at Michigan State University, and young girls who came to him for treatment of ordinary sports injuries. He exploited the power dynamics inherent in the doctor-patient relationship, the culture of USA Gymnastics that demanded absolute obedience and discouraged questioning of authority figures, and the trust that parents placed in medical professionals. Many victims did not immediately recognize the abuse for what it was, having been told by Nassar that his procedures were standard medical treatment, and those who did feel uncomfortable or questioned his methods were often dismissed, told they were misunderstanding a medical procedure, or made to feel that they were being prudish or difficult. Some victims who reported Nassar's abuse to coaches, administrators, or other authority figures were ignored, disbelieved, or even punished, as institutions prioritized protecting their reputation and maintaining their relationship with a prestigious doctor over investigating allegations from young athletes. The first known complaint against Nassar came in 1997, when a gymnast told her coach that Nassar had molested her during a medical appointment, but this complaint was not properly investigated by Michigan State University, and Nassar was allowed to continue treating patients for nearly 2 more decades. In 2004, another athlete filed a complaint with MSU police, providing a detailed account of sexual abuse by Nassar, but the investigation was mishandled. A prosecuting attorney declined to file charges citing insufficient evidence, and again Nassar faced no consequences. Over the years, multiple young women reported similar experiences to various authority figures, but each time, The complaints were either not taken seriously, not properly investigated, or resulted in Nassar receiving minimal sanctions such as having a third party present during examinations, a requirement he often ignored. The systemic failure to stop Nassar involved multiple institutions including USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the United States Olympic Committee, all of which received reports of abuse, conducted inadequate or sham investigations, and prioritized institutional interests over athlete safety. The dam finally broke in 2016, when former gymnast Rachel Den Hollander published a detailed account of Nassar's abuse in an investigation by the Indianapolis Star newspaper. Den Hollander, who had been abused by Nassar as a 15-year-old and had reported it years earlier only to be ignored, came forward publicly with her story, providing specific details of the abuse and explaining how Nassar had used medical terminology and authority to manipulate her. Her courage in speaking out prompted other victims to come forward, and soon dozens. Then hundreds of women began sharing their stories of abuse at Nassar's hands. In September 2016, Michigan State University fired Nassar, and he was arrested on federal child pornography charges after investigators searching his home discovered more than 37,000 images of child sexual abuse on his computers. As the investigation expanded, additional charges were filed in multiple jurisdictions. In November 2016, Nassar was charged in Michigan State Court with criminal sexual conduct involving multiple victims. The criminal cases proceeded in both federal and state court simultaneously. In July 2017, Nassar pleaded guilty to federal child pornography charges, admitting to possessing and destroying evidence of child sexual abuse material. In November 2017, he pleaded guilty to 7 counts of criminal sexual conduct in Ingham County, Michigan, and shortly thereafter pleaded guilty to an additional 3 counts in neighboring Eaton County. The sentencing hearings became historic events. In January 2018, Ingham County Circuit Court Judge Rosemary Aquilina presided over a sentencing hearing that lasted 7 days, during which 156 women and girls gave victim impact statements, courageously describing the abuse they had suffered and the devastating impact it had on their lives. Olympic champions Ali Raisman, Jordan Weber, and Michaela Maroney were among those who spoke, as was Rachel Den Hollander, whose statement was particularly powerful in detailing not only the abuse but also the systemic failures that had allowed it to continue. One after another, survivors stood before the court and confronted Nassar, telling the world what he had done to them and reclaiming their voices and their power. The impact statements revealed the profound trauma that Nassar's abuse had caused, including PTSD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, self-harm, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. Many survivors described struggling with intimate relationships, feeling violated and betrayed by someone they had trusted, and dealing with guilt and shame even though they had done nothing wrong. Judge Aquilina sentenced Nassar to 40 to 175 years in Michigan State Prison, telling him that she had just signed his death warrant and that he would die in prison. In February 2018, in Eaton County, Judge Janice Cunningham sentenced Nassar to an additional 40 to 125 years in prison. In December 2017, on the federal charges, Nassar had been sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. With these sentences running consecutively, Nassar received what amounts to multiple life sentences, ensuring that he will never be released from custody. He is currently held at the United States Penitentiary Coleman II, a high-security federal prison in Florida, where he will remain until his death. In May 2018, shortly after arriving at the federal prison, Nassar was assaulted by other inmates who beat him severely, though he survived. The revelations about Nassar's decades of abuse and the institutional failures that enabled it led to widespread consequences. USA Gymnastics filed for bankruptcy in 2018 as it faced hundreds of lawsuits from survivors. The entire board of USA Gymnastics resigned, and the organization underwent substantial restructuring. Michigan State University faced intense scrutiny and criticism for its handling of abuse reports, and in 2018, the university reached a $500 million settlement with 332 survivors of Nassar's abuse, one of the largest settlements in the history of sexual abuse cases. University President Lou Anna Simon resigned, and several other administrators left their positions. The scandal also prompted federal legislation including the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse and Safe Sport Authorization Act, which mandated reporting requirements for abuse allegations in amateur athletics. The number of Nassar's victims stands at more than 500 women and girls who have come forward, though some advocates believe there may be additional victims who have not yet disclosed their abuse. The case represents one of the largest sexual abuse scandals in sports history and exposed the catastrophic consequences of institutional indifference to abuse allegations and the prioritization of reputation and success over athlete safety. Number 5. Dr. Aribert Heim, the Nazi concentration camp doctor who tortured prisoners in medical experiments and remained a fugitive for decades. Aribert Ferdinand Heim was born on June 28, 1914, in Bad Radkersburg, Austria. During the final years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he pursued a career in medicine, studying at the University of Graz and completing his medical degree in 1940. During the height of Nazi Germany's expansion across Europe, Heim joined the Nazi Party and the SS, Germany's paramilitary organization that played a central role in carrying out the Holocaust and other war crimes. By 1941, Heim was serving as an SS doctor in the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system where thousands of prisoners, including Jews, political prisoners, resistance fighters, and others deemed enemies of the Reich, were subjected to forced labor, torture, starvation, and execution. During his relatively brief tenure at Mauthausen from October 1941 to early 1942, Heim earned the nickname Dr. Death among prisoners for the sadistic medical experiments and murders he carried out. Survivors testified that Heim performed operations on healthy prisoners without anesthesia, not to provide medical care but to practice surgical techniques and to torture. He would remove organs from living victims, including kidneys, livers, and stomachs, watching as prisoners died in agony on the operating table. In one particularly horrific account, a prisoner testified that Heim injected various toxic substances directly into prisoners' hearts to observe the effects, timing how long it took them to die, and recording the results for his research. Other testimony described how Heim would decapitate prisoners and keep their skulls as trophies after boiling the flesh off, displaying these remains in his quarters. He selected victims arbitrarily, often choosing prisoners who were young and healthy specifically because their suffering would last longer and provide more data for his experiments. The prisoners had no choice and no recourse. They were completely at the mercy of their captors, and Heim exploited this absolute power with sadistic enthusiasm. Estimates suggest that Heim personally killed dozens to hundreds of prisoners during his time at Mauthausen, though exact numbers are difficult to determine due to the chaos of the camp system and the Nazis' efforts to destroy evidence of their crimes. After his brief posting at Mauthausen, Heim was transferred to other assignments within the SS Medical Corps and served until the end of World War II in 1945. When Germany surrendered, Heim successfully avoided immediate capture by Allied forces and assumed a false identity, blending into the chaos of post-war Europe where millions of displaced persons, refugees, and former combatants were trying to rebuild their lives. For several years, Heim lived under an assumed name in West Germany, eventually obtaining legitimate identity documents in his real name as denazification processes became less stringent, and many former Nazi Party members were able to reintegrate into society. By the early 1950s, Heim had re-established himself as a physician, opening a successful gynecology practice in Baden-Baden, a wealthy spa town in southwestern Germany. He married, had 2 children, and appeared to be a respectable, affluent member of the community, hiding his past as a war criminal. However, by the 1960s, German prosecutors and Nazi hunters, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center, had begun investigating war crimes at Mauthausen and other concentration camps, gathering testimony from survivors and building cases against perpetrators. Witnesses who had survived Mauthausen identified Heim as the doctor who had tortured and murdered prisoners, providing detailed accounts of his crimes. In 1962, German authorities issued an arrest warrant for Heim on charges of murder and crimes against humanity, preparing to bring him to trial. Somehow, Heim learned that he was about to be arrested, possibly through contacts within Germany's legal or government systems where some former Nazis still held positions and protected one another. In September 1962, just before police were to apprehend him, Heim fled Germany, abandoning his medical practice, his home, and his family to avoid prosecution. He first went to France, but fearing capture there as well, he eventually made his way to North Africa. According to later investigations, Heim settled in Cairo, Egypt, where he converted to Islam, adopted the name Tariq Hussein Farid, and lived in hiding for the rest of his life. Egypt had no extradition treaty with Germany and was home to a number of Nazi war criminals who had fled there after the war, some of whom had even been employed by the Egyptian government in various capacities during the Cold War era. Heim maintained a low profile in Cairo, working at times as a doctor and living modestly in a hotel, supported financially by his family in Germany who allegedly sent him money while claiming not to know his whereabouts. For decades, Heim was one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals, with the Simon Wiesenthal Center offering rewards for information leading to his capture and arrest. Investigators searched for him across multiple continents, following leads in South America, Spain, and other locations where Nazis were known to have fled. The mystery of Heim's whereabouts became one of the most enduring unsolved cases in Nazi hunting. In 2009, a German public television investigation and the New York Times reported findings suggesting that Heim had died in Cairo in 1992 at the age of 78, having lived there under his assumed identity for 3 decades. The investigation uncovered records including a will, financial documents, and testimony from individuals who had known him in Egypt. Egyptian authorities later confirmed that a death certificate had been issued for Tariq Hussein Farid in 1992, and a briefcase allegedly belonging to Heim was found containing personal documents, medical instruments, and other items that corroborated the claim that he had lived and died in Cairo. However, some investigators and Nazi hunters remained skeptical, questioning whether the evidence was genuine or whether Heim had staged his death to finally stop being pursued. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and other organizations continued to list Heim as wanted for several years, unwilling to close the case without absolute certainty. Eventually, as more evidence accumulated including DNA testing and further documentation, most authorities accepted that Heim had indeed died in 1992, meaning he had successfully evaded justice for his crimes for half a century, living in hiding until his natural death at 78. The fact that Heim was never brought to trial or held accountable for his horrific crimes at Mauthausen represents a profound failure of justice and a deep wound for survivors and their families. The case also highlighted the difficulties in pursuing Nazi war criminals decades after their crimes, the challenges of international cooperation in bringing fugitives to justice, and the ways in which some perpetrators of the Holocaust were able to escape accountability by fleeing to countries that provided safe haven. Heim's crimes at Mauthausen were thoroughly documented through survivor testimony and historical records, leaving no doubt about his guilt, making his successful evasion of capture all the more frustrating. His story serves as a reminder of the importance of pursuing justice for victims of atrocities, no matter how much time has passed, and the need for international cooperation in ensuring that those who commit crimes against humanity cannot simply disappear and live out their lives in comfort and freedom. Number 6. Dr. Josef Mengele, the Nazi physician known as the Angel of Death who conducted grotesque experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, Bavaria, Germany, into a prosperous family that owned a farm equipment manufacturing business. He was a bright student who pursued higher education at the University of Munich, where he studied philosophy and medicine, earning doctorates in both anthropology and medicine by 1935 and 1938, respectively. Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1938, embracing the racist ideology of National Socialism with enthusiasm. He became particularly interested in genetics and eugenics, the pseudoscientific belief that human populations could be improved through selective breeding, an idea that was central to Nazi racial theory. In 1943, Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps in occupied Poland, where over 1 million people, primarily Jews, were murdered during the Holocaust. At Auschwitz, Mengele served as one of the camp doctors responsible for conducting selections of incoming prisoners, deciding who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and who would be temporarily spared for forced labor. Mengele approached this horrific task with a disturbing cheerfulness, often whistling classical music as he gestured prisoners to their deaths with a flick of his finger or riding crop. Survivors remembered him as an elegant figure who appeared at the selection ramp wearing a well-tailored uniform, polished boots, and white gloves, presenting a cultured, refined appearance that contrasted grotesquely with the mass murder he was facilitating. Beyond his role in selections, Mengele conducted medical experiments on prisoners that were characterized by their cruelty, lack of scientific value, and complete disregard for human suffering. He had a particular obsession with twins, dwarfs, and people with physical abnormalities, whom he selected from the incoming transports and housed in special barracks so he could use them as experimental subjects. Mengele's experiments on twins were particularly extensive and cruel. He sought to unlock the secrets of heredity and to find ways to increase the birth rate of Aryan children through multiple births, believing this would help Germany win its racial struggle. Mengele performed experiments that included taking blood samples from one twin and injecting it into the other to observe reactions, injecting various chemicals including chloroform directly into twins' eyes to try to change their eye color, deliberately infecting one twin with diseases to study the progression while comparing them to their healthy twin, performing surgeries without anesthesia including organ removal and limb amputation, and in some cases, killing twins simultaneously and performing comparative autopsies to study genetic differences. Survivors recalled Mengele bringing candy and toys to the twins, treating them with false kindness one moment before subjecting them to agonizing experiments the next, creating a psychological torture that compounded the physical suffering. Mengele also conducted experiments on pregnant women, often forcing them to undergo abortions or delivering babies only to kill them immediately and dissect them. He experimented with sterilization techniques, trying to find efficient methods to sterilize populations the Nazis deemed inferior without the victims realizing what had been done to them. In one particularly horrific experiment, Mengele attempted to create conjoined twins by surgically attaching two Roma children together, an operation that resulted in gangrene and an agonizing death for the victims. He kept meticulous records of his experiments, documenting measurements, observations, and results with scientific detachment, treating human beings as laboratory specimens rather than people. The number of people who died as a direct result of Mengele's experiments is unknown but estimated in the hundreds, and many more who survived the experiments suffered permanent physical and psychological damage. Of approximately 3,000 twins who passed through Mengele's hands at Auschwitz, only about 200 survived the camp, a mortality rate of over 90%. When the Soviet army liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, Mengele fled westward with the retreating German forces, taking his experimental records with him, though some were later recovered. He successfully evaded immediate capture by assuming a false identity and hiding among the millions of displaced persons in post-war Europe. By 1949, Mengele had obtained papers under an alias and fled to South America, first to Argentina, where he lived openly under his real name for years, protected by the Perón government which welcomed Nazi fugitives. He worked various jobs and even visited his family in Germany briefly, demonstrating the lack of serious efforts to apprehend Nazi war criminals in the immediate post-war years. As international pressure increased and other Nazi war criminals were captured and tried, including Adolf Eichmann, who was abducted from Argentina by Israeli agents in 1960, Mengele became more cautious and moved to Paraguay and later Brazil, living under assumed names and relying on a network of Nazi sympathizers and supporters to protect him. Despite being one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals, with rewards offered for information leading to his capture and repeated efforts by Nazi hunters including the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Israeli Mossad to locate him, Mengele successfully avoided capture for the rest of his life. He moved frequently within South America, lived with various families who sheltered him, and maintained contact with his family in Germany who allegedly provided him with financial support. In 1979, Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach in Bertioga, Brazil, and drowned at the age of 67, living under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. His death remained unknown to authorities for several years. In 1985, acting on intelligence and tips, police in Brazil exhumed a body buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, and forensic examination, including comparison with Mengele's dental records and skeletal features, strongly suggested that it was indeed Mengele. DNA testing conducted in 1992 using a bone sample compared with blood from Mengele's son confirmed with certainty that Josef Mengele had died in 1979 and had been buried in Brazil under a false name. Like Aribert Heim, Mengele had successfully evaded justice, dying of natural causes without ever being held accountable for his monstrous crimes. The fact that Mengele lived in relative comfort in South America for over 3 decades after the Holocaust, enjoying freedom while his victims and their families lived with trauma and loss, represents a profound failure of international justice. His case became emblematic of the difficulties in pursuing Nazi war criminals who fled to countries unwilling or unable to cooperate with extradition requests, and the ways in which some of the worst perpetrators of the Holocaust escaped punishment. Mengele's experiments at Auschwitz are considered some of the most horrific war crimes of the Nazi regime, violations of every principle of medical ethics and human rights, and his name has become synonymous with medical evil and the abuse of scientific authority for cruel and murderous purposes. The survivors of his experiments, many of whom suffered lifelong physical and psychological trauma, testified extensively about his crimes in subsequent war crimes trials and historical documentation, ensuring that his atrocities would not be forgotten even though he personally never faced justice. Number 7. Dr. H. Holmes, America's first documented serial killer who built a murder hotel in Chicago. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, into a prosperous farming family. From an early age, Mudgett displayed intelligence and charm, but also a disturbing fascination with death and a propensity for deception and manipulation. He excelled academically and pursued a medical degree at the University of Michigan Medical School, graduating in 1884 and becoming a licensed physician. During his time in medical school, Mudgett engaged in insurance fraud schemes, taking out policies on individuals and then using cadavers from the medical school to fake their deaths and collect the payouts, demonstrating both his criminal inclinations and his comfort with handling dead bodies. After graduating, Mudgett moved to Chicago and assumed the alias H. Holmes, the name by which he would become infamous. He arrived in the city during a period of explosive growth and opportunity, as Chicago was preparing to host the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, a massive World's Fair that would attract millions of visitors from around the globe. Holmes saw this influx of people, particularly young women arriving alone in the city seeking employment and excitement, as an opportunity for his criminal enterprises. In 1886, Holmes began working at a pharmacy owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Holton in the Englewood neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. When Mrs. Holton's husband died, Holmes convinced her to let him purchase the pharmacy, though she mysteriously disappeared shortly thereafter, and Holmes claimed she had moved to California to be with relatives, though investigators later suspected he had murdered her. With control of the pharmacy and the property, Holmes began an ambitious construction project. Across the street from the pharmacy, he purchased an empty lot and began building what would become known as Holmes's Murder Castle or the World's Fair Hotel, a 3-story mixed-use building that appeared from the outside to be a normal commercial and residential structure but was in fact designed as a facility for torture and murder. Holmes personally oversaw the construction, frequently changing architects and builders to ensure that no single person understood the complete layout, and designing the building with a labyrinth of windowless rooms, secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof chambers, hidden staircases, and chutes leading to the basement. The second and third floors contained over 100 rooms with peculiar features including doors that opened to brick walls, staircases that led nowhere, hallways that zigzagged confusingly, rooms with gas jets that could be controlled from Holmes's quarters to asphyxiate occupants, and peepholes that allowed Holmes to spy on guests. In the basement, Holmes installed a dissection table, surgical equipment, acid vats, quicklime pits for dissolving bodies, and a large furnace that could incinerate human remains, as well as various torture devices. Holmes opened the building as a hotel just in time for the World's Fair in 1893, advertising rooms for rent particularly to single women visiting the exposition. He also used the building for various legitimate businesses including shops and offices that he rented out to unsuspecting tenants. The hotel allowed Holmes to prey on a steady stream of victims who came and went without attracting attention in the chaotic, crowded city filled with transient visitors. Holmes's typical pattern was to charm young women, often hiring them to work in his pharmacy or other businesses, engaging them romantically, and gaining their trust. Once he had isolated a victim, he would lure them to a specially prepared room in the hotel, where he would lock them in and either asphyxiate them with gas, torture them, or kill them through various means. He would then dissect the bodies in his basement, using his medical training to efficiently dispose of remains, either dissolving them in acid, burning them in his furnace, or stripping the flesh and selling the skeletons to medical schools and anatomical supply companies for profit. Some victims were killed purely for financial gain after Holmes convinced them to sign over their life savings or take out insurance policies with him as the beneficiary, while others appear to have been murdered simply because Holmes enjoyed killing. The exact number of Holmes's victims will never be known with certainty, but estimates range from as few as 9 confirmed murders to possibly over 200 victims over the course of several years. Among his known victims were Julia Smythe Connor and her daughter Pearl, who disappeared after Julia had an affair with Holmes; Emmeline Segrand, who worked as a stenographer for Holmes and was engaged to marry him before disappearing; and the 3 Pitzel children, whose murders would ultimately lead to Holmes's capture. Holmes's downfall began with a complex insurance fraud scheme involving his associate Benjamin Pitzel. The plan was for Pitzel to fake his death using a cadaver, allowing them to collect a $10,000 life insurance policy. But Holmes actually murdered Pitzel instead of using a substitute corpse, making the insurance payout real. Holmes then convinced Pitzel's widow to allow him to take 3 of her children, allegedly to hide them from authorities while the insurance fraud was being investigated. But instead Holmes murdered the children, likely to eliminate witnesses and to facilitate additional fraud schemes. When authorities began investigating the insurance claim and the disappearance of the Pitzel children, Detective Frank Geyer tracked Holmes's movements across several states, eventually discovering the bodies of 2 of the Pitzel children buried in a Toronto basement and the remains of the 3rd child in Indianapolis. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894 on the insurance fraud charges, and as police investigated further, the full extent of his crimes began to emerge. Investigators searched the Chicago hotel and discovered the horrifying chambers and evidence of numerous murders, including bone fragments, bloodstains, personal belongings from missing persons, surgical instruments, and the equipment Holmes had used to dispose of bodies. Witnesses came forward identifying Holmes as the last person seen with various missing individuals. Holmes was tried in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, as that was where the most solid evidence existed. The trial began on October 28, 1895, and the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Holmes's guilt, including testimony from witnesses, physical evidence, and Holmes's own contradictory statements. Holmes represented himself for part of the trial and presented a bizarre defense that alternated between denial and elaborate lies, demonstrating the same manipulative charm that had allowed him to lure victims but failing to convince the jury. He was convicted of first-degree murder on November 2, 1895, after only 3 hours of deliberation. Judge Michael Arnold sentenced Holmes to death by hanging, and he was executed on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia at the age of 34. In his final days, Holmes gave several contradictory confessions, at one point claiming to have killed 27 people, then recanting some confessions, making it difficult to determine the true scope of his crimes. Some criminologists and historians consider Holmes to be America's first documented serial killer, a predecessor to the modern concept of serial murder, and his case has fascinated true crime enthusiasts and researchers for over a century. The murder castle was partially destroyed by fire in August 1895 under mysterious circumstances while Holmes awaited execution, with some suspecting arson to destroy evidence, and the building was eventually demolished entirely. Holmes's story has become legendary in American crime history, inspiring books, films, and most notably Eric Larson's best-selling book The Devil in the White City, which interweaves Holmes's murder spree with the story of the 1893 World's Fair. While some aspects of the Holmes legend have been embellished or exaggerated over the years, the core facts remain. He was a charming, intelligent physician who used his medical knowledge and his specially designed building to murder numerous victims during the 1890s, making him one of the most prolific and notorious serial killers in American history and demonstrating how education, professional credentials, and social respectability can mask monstrous evil. Number 8. Dr. Jack Kevorkian, the pathologist who assisted in over 130 patient suicides and was imprisoned for murder. Jack Kevorkian was born on May 26, 1928, in Pontiac, Michigan, to Armenian immigrants who had survived the Armenian genocide. He excelled in school and pursued a medical degree at the University of Michigan Medical School, graduating in 1952 and specializing in pathology, the study of disease through examination of tissues and bodily fluids. Kevorkian developed an early interest in death and dying, which his colleagues found unusual and somewhat morbid. During his residency, he took photographs of patients' eyes at the moment of death, believing he could determine the exact moment the soul left the body by observing changes in the eyes, research that disturbed many of his colleagues. Throughout his career, Kevorkian held various pathology positions at hospitals in Michigan and California, but he struggled to maintain long-term employment due to his controversial ideas and abrasive personality. By the 1980s, Kevorkian had become obsessed with the concept of physician-assisted suicide, believing that terminally ill patients had a fundamental right to end their lives with medical assistance and that doctors should be allowed to help them die peacefully and painlessly. He began advocating publicly for the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia, writing articles and giving interviews in which he argued that relieving suffering was a physician's highest duty, even if that meant helping patients die. When no medical institutions would support his ideas, Kevorkian decided to act independently. In 1989, he built a device he called the Thanatron, which means death machine in Greek, using parts purchased from garage sales and hardware stores. The device allowed patients to self-administer a lethal dose of drugs by pressing a button, starting an intravenous drip of saline solution followed by a sedative and finally potassium chloride, which would stop the heart. Kevorkian advertised his services and began receiving calls from terminally ill patients who wanted his help to die. On June 4, 1990, Kevorkian assisted in his first documented suicide, helping Janet Adkins, a 54-year-old woman suffering from early-stage Alzheimer's disease, end her life in the back of Kevorkian's rusty 1968 Volkswagen van parked in a campground. Adkins activated the Thanatron herself, and Kevorkian monitored her vital signs as she died. He then called police and openly admitted what he had done, framing it as a medical service and a moral act. The case caused immediate controversy and media sensation. Kevorkian was charged with murder, but the charges were eventually dismissed because Michigan had no specific law against assisted suicide at the time. Over the next 8 years, Kevorkian assisted in approximately 130 suicides, according to his own records, becoming a polarizing national figure. Supporters hailed him as a compassionate advocate for patient rights and personal autonomy, arguing that terminally ill people should have the choice to end their suffering on their own terms, while opponents, including many in the medical community, religious organizations, and disability rights advocates, condemned him as a dangerous zealot who was practicing medicine without proper oversight, exploiting vulnerable people, and undermining the sanctity of life. Many of Kevorkian's critics pointed out serious problems with his methods. He often had minimal or no prior relationship with the patients he assisted, sometimes meeting them only hours before their deaths, which meant he could not thoroughly assess whether they were suffering from treatable depression, whether they fully understood their prognosis, or whether they were being pressured by family members. In several cases, autopsies revealed that patients Kevorkian had helped die were not actually terminally ill or were in the early stages of disease and might have lived for years with proper treatment. For example, some patients had conditions like chronic pain or non-terminal degenerative diseases rather than imminent death sentences, raising questions about whether Kevorkian was assisting suicides of people who were simply tired of living rather than dying of terminal illness. Kevorkian kept detailed records of the deaths he assisted, including videotapes, which he sometimes provided to the media, viewing himself as a crusader whose publicity would force society to confront the issue of assisted suicide. In response to Kevorkian's activities, Michigan passed laws specifically criminalizing assisted suicide, but Kevorkian openly defied these laws, continuing to assist suicides and daring prosecutors to charge him. He was tried multiple times for murder and assisted suicide, but juries repeatedly acquitted him, apparently sympathizing with his stated mission to relieve suffering even if they had concerns about his methods. Kevorkian became increasingly bold and confrontational, seeming to enjoy the media attention and his role as a provocateur. In 1998, Kevorkian crossed a line that would finally lead to his conviction. He assisted in the death of Thomas Yook, a 52-year-old man suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Unlike his previous cases where patients had activated the suicide device themselves, Kevorkian personally administered a lethal injection to Yook, making this not assisted suicide but direct euthanasia and clearly constituting murder under Michigan law. Kevorkian videotaped the entire procedure and then provided the tape to the CBS News program 60 Minutes, which broadcast it nationally on November 22, 1998. In the broadcast, Kevorkian openly challenged prosecutors to charge him, saying he wanted to force a legal test case that would establish the right to die. Oakland County Prosecutor David Gorsera accepted the challenge and charged Kevorkian with first-degree murder and delivery of a controlled substance. Against the strong advice of his attorneys, Kevorkian insisted on representing himself at trial, believing his passion and moral certainty would persuade the jury. The trial began on March 22, 1999, in Oakland County Circuit Court. Kevorkian's defense was that he had acted out of compassion to end unbearable suffering and that Yuk had consented to the procedure, but the judge ruled that consent is not a defense to murder under Michigan law and barred Kevorkian from presenting evidence about Yuk's suffering or wishes. The jury had no choice but to evaluate whether Kevorkian had intentionally killed Yuk, which he had openly admitted. On March 26, 1999, after deliberating for just 13 hours, the jury convicted Kevorkian of second-degree murder and delivery of a controlled substance. On April 13, 1999, Judge Jessica Cooper sentenced Kevorkian to 10 to 25 years in prison for the murder conviction and 3 to 7 years for the controlled substance conviction, with the sentences to run concurrently. In her sentencing remarks, Judge Cooper stated that Kevorkian's role was that of a medical serial killer and that he had shown no remorse or understanding that he had done anything wrong. She noted that while people could have different opinions about assisted suicide and end-of-life care, Kevorkian had taken the law into his own hands, appointed himself as judge and jury over who should live and die, and killed a man on national television. Kevorkian, then 70 years old, was sent to a Michigan correctional facility where he would serve 8 years before being paroled. In prison, Kevorkian's health declined significantly. He was eventually diagnosed with hepatitis C and other ailments. Despite his deteriorating health, he remained unrepentant about his actions, continuing to argue that he had been morally right even if legally wrong. After serving 8 years of his sentence, Kevorkian was paroled on June 1, 2007, at age 79, on the condition that he would not assist in any more suicides or provide advice about suicide to anyone. He agreed to these conditions, and upon release, he attempted to continue advocating for changes in assisted suicide laws through lectures and public appearances, though his health was poor and his influence had waned. Kevorkian ran an unsuccessful campaign for U.S. Congress in 2008, receiving only 2.6% of the vote, and spent his final years living in a small apartment in Michigan. He died on June 3, 2011, at the age of 82 from kidney problems and heart disease at Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan, the same hospital where he had once worked as a pathologist. The irony that Kevorkian, who had helped so many others die, ended up dying a natural death in a hospital was noted by many observers. Kevorkian's legacy remains deeply controversial. Supporters argue that he brought attention to important issues of patient autonomy, end-of-life care, and the right to die with dignity, and point out that several jurisdictions including Oregon, Washington, Vermont, California, Colorado, and others have since legalized physician-assisted suicide under carefully regulated conditions, suggesting that public opinion shifted partly due to the conversation Kevorkian forced. Critics maintain that Kevorkian was reckless, operated without proper safeguards or oversight, helped people die who were not actually terminally ill or who might have changed their minds with proper counseling and treatment, and that his actions set back the legitimate movement for compassionate end-of-life care by associating it with a zealot operating out of a van. Medical ethicists have pointed out that modern physician-assisted suicide laws include numerous safeguards that Kevorkian did not employ, including waiting periods, multiple physician evaluations, psychiatric assessment to rule out depression, and restrictions limiting the practice to patients with terminal diagnoses and life expectancies of 6 months or less. Regardless of one's position on the ethics of assisted suicide, Kevorkian's case demonstrates the dangers of an individual acting outside the legal and ethical frameworks designed to protect vulnerable people, and serves as a cautionary tale about how good intentions without proper oversight and checks can lead to harm. Number 9. Dr. Karl Clauberg, the Nazi gynecologist who conducted sterilization experiments on women in concentration camps. Karl Clauberg was born on September 28, 1898, in Wupperhof, Germany, and pursued a medical career specializing in gynecology and fertility. He became a well-regarded physician in Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, conducting research on hormones and fertility treatments and developing some innovative approaches to treating infertility, building a respectable professional reputation. Clauberg joined the Nazi Party in 1933, shortly after Hitler came to power, and became an enthusiastic supporter of Nazi racial ideology, including the belief in eugenics and racial purity. In the Nazi worldview, certain groups of people including Jews, Roma, Slavs, and others deemed racially inferior needed to be prevented from reproducing, and ideally eliminated entirely, while Aryans needed to be encouraged to have large families. Clauberg saw an opportunity to advance his career and conduct research by offering his services to the Nazi regime's racial programs. In 1942, Clauberg approached Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, with a proposal to develop methods of mass sterilization that could be performed quickly, cheaply, and without the victim's knowledge. Himmler enthusiastically supported this idea, seeing it as a way to render millions of people infertile while preserving them as a slave labor force, and he provided Clauberg with a facility at Auschwitz concentration camp where he could conduct his experiments on prisoners. Clauberg was given a section of the camp with his own laboratories and medical facilities, an essentially unlimited supply of human subjects who had no choice but to submit to his experiments, and complete freedom to pursue his research without ethical constraints or oversight. Beginning in 1942 and continuing until the camp's liberation in 1945, Clauberg conducted horrific sterilization experiments primarily on Jewish women but also on Roma women and others. His method involved injecting various caustic substances directly into women's uteruses and fallopian tubes without anesthesia, substances that included formaldehyde, various chemical irritants, and his own experimental compounds designed to cause scarring and blockage that would prevent pregnancy. The injections caused excruciating pain, and many women suffered severe complications including infections, hemorrhaging, peritonitis, and sepsis. Some women died from these complications while others were left with permanent damage, chronic pain, and of course permanent infertility. Clauberg treated his victims not as human beings but as experimental subjects, showing no compassion for their suffering and viewing the pain they experienced as merely unfortunate side effects of the research process. He kept meticulous records of his experiments, documenting the substances used, the dosages, the reactions, and the outcomes, treating the torture of thousands of women as a scientific research project. Survivors recalled Clauberg as cold and professional in his demeanor, performing the injections and examinations with clinical detachment while women screamed in agony. In addition to the sterilization experiments, Clauberg conducted other research at Auschwitz including experiments on artificial insemination and hormonal treatments, and he worked on developing methods to determine whether sterilization had been successful, often by conducting painful examinations, taking biopsies, or even removing organs for study. Clauberg corresponded regularly with Himmler, reporting on his progress and claiming that he had developed methods that could sterilize thousands of women per day at minimal cost, making mass sterilization of entire populations feasible. Estimates suggest that Clauberg experimented on approximately 700 women at Auschwitz, many of whom died from the procedures or from subsequent infections and complications, while survivors suffered lifelong physical and psychological trauma. As Soviet forces approached Auschwitz in January 1945, Clauberg evacuated westward with other SS personnel, bringing some of his research materials and transferring some of his experimental subjects to other camps. After Germany's surrender, Clauberg was captured by Soviet forces in June 1945 and was taken to the Soviet Union, where he was tried for war crimes by a Soviet military tribunal. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison, serving his sentence in various Soviet labor camps where conditions were harsh and he experienced some measure of the suffering he had inflicted on others. In 1955, as part of post-war prisoner exchanges between the Soviet Union and West Germany, Clauberg was released and allowed to return to West Germany, a decision that outraged many survivors and victims' advocates. Shockingly, upon his return to Germany, Clauberg attempted to resume his medical career and even boasted about the research he had conducted at Auschwitz, apparently believing that he would be celebrated for his scientific work and failing to recognize the moral horror of what he had done. He gave interviews and wrote letters discussing his experiments in clinical terms, showing no remorse and seemingly proud of his innovations in sterilization techniques. Public outrage and pressure from survivors' organizations led West German authorities to arrest Clauberg in November 1955 on charges of murder and crimes against humanity. He was held in a prison in Kiel while prosecutors prepared a case against him, gathering evidence and testimony from survivors. However, before he could be brought to trial, Karl Clauberg died in his prison cell on August 9, 1957, at the age of 58, reportedly from a stroke or heart attack, though some rumors suggested he might have been killed by other prisoners who were horrified by his crimes. His death meant that he was never held publicly accountable in a trial, never forced to face his victims in court, and never received the severe sentence that his crimes warranted. Like other Nazi doctors who committed atrocities, Clauberg represents the profound ethical violations that occur when physicians abandon their duty to heal and instead use their medical knowledge to harm, exploit, and kill, all in the service of an evil ideology. His case also highlights the failures of post-war justice, as his initial sentence in the Soviet Union was relatively lenient and his early release allowed him to live in freedom, albeit briefly, rather than serving a life sentence or facing execution for his crimes. The women who survived Clauberg's experiments testified at various war crimes trials and historical proceedings, ensuring that their suffering and his crimes were documented for history, and their courage in speaking about the horrific abuse they endured has been crucial in educating future generations about the Holocaust and the specific ways in which medical professionals participated in Nazi atrocities. Number 10. Dr. Linda Hazzard, the American physician who starved patients to death at her sanitarium under the guise of fasting therapy. Linda Laura Burfield was born in 1867 in Carver County, Minnesota, and pursued an unconventional path into medicine at a time when opportunities for women in the profession were limited. She studied at a school of osteopathy, a form of alternative medicine, and claimed medical credentials, though her qualifications were questionable and she was never fully licensed as a physician in the traditional sense. Burfield married Samuel Christman Hazzard, and as Linda Hazzard she began practicing medicine and promoting her own theories about health and healing. Hazzard developed a fanatical belief in the healing power of fasting, claiming that most diseases were caused by toxins in the body and that the cure was to stop eating almost entirely, allowing the body to purge these toxins through an extended fast. She wrote a book titled Fasting for the Cure of Disease in which she outlined her theories, arguing that patients should fast for weeks or even months, consuming only small amounts of tomato and asparagus broth, and that this extreme deprivation would cure conditions ranging from cancer to mental illness. Hazzard's fasting cure was essentially a starvation regimen, and she attracted patients who were desperately seeking alternatives to conventional medicine, particularly wealthy individuals with chronic conditions who had not been helped by traditional doctors. By the early 1900s, Hazzard had established a sanitarium called Wilderness Heights in Olalla, Washington, where she housed patients and subjected them to her fasting treatment. The facility was remote and isolated, making it difficult for patients to leave or for outsiders to observe what was happening. Hazzard's treatment protocol involved placing patients on extended fasts during which they consumed almost no calories, combined with daily enemas, vigorous massages, and exposure to harsh conditions. Patients rapidly lost weight, became weak and emaciated, and many died from starvation and related complications. Hazzard maintained that these deaths were the result of the patient's underlying diseases releasing toxins, not the starvation itself, and she convinced many patients and their families that the suffering was a necessary part of the healing process. In reality, Hazzard was systematically starving her patients to death, and evidence suggests that she had financial motives as well as ideological ones. Many of her patients were wealthy, and Hazzard had a pattern of isolating patients from their families, gaining their trust and access to their finances, persuading them to sign over property and valuables, and then allowing them to die while she profited from their estates. In 1911, Claire and Dorothea Williamson, two wealthy British sisters who suffered from various minor ailments, arrived at Hazzard's sanitarium seeking treatment. Hazzard immediately placed them on her fasting regimen, and over the following weeks both women became dangerously thin and weak. Dorothea, the younger sister, became so ill that the British vice-consul in Tacoma, Lucian Agassiz, intervened and removed her from the sanitarium, likely saving her life. However, Claire remained under Hazzard's care and continued to deteriorate. According to later testimony, Hazzard isolated Claire completely, prevented her from communicating with her family, forged her signature on documents transferring property to Hazzard, and continued the starvation despite Claire's obviously declining health. On May 19, 1911, Claire Williamson died weighing approximately 50 pounds, literally starved to death under Hazzard's care. Her death certificate listed starvation as the cause, but Hazzard claimed it was due to cirrhosis of the liver and other conditions. Dorothea Williamson, who had barely survived and was recovering, along with the British vice-consul and other concerned parties, demanded an investigation into Claire's death and the conditions at Wilderness Heights. Authorities exhumed Claire's body and confirmed that she had died of starvation, and that there was no evidence of the serious underlying diseases Hazzard had claimed. Investigators also uncovered evidence that numerous other patients had died at Hazzard's sanitarium under similar circumstances, with at least 40 deaths attributed to her treatment methods, though the actual number may be higher. On August 4, 1911, Linda Hazzard was arrested and charged with the murder of Claire Williamson. Her trial began in January 1912 in Kitsap County, Washington, and attracted significant media attention. The prosecution presented evidence of Claire's condition when she died, testimony from Dorothea about the horrific treatment both sisters had endured, financial records showing that Hazzard had gained control of the Williamsons' money and property, and evidence of other suspicious deaths at the sanitarium. The defense argued that Hazzard genuinely believed in her fasting cure and that Claire had died from pre-existing conditions, but the evidence of starvation and financial manipulation was overwhelming. On February 15, 1912, the jury convicted Hazzard of manslaughter rather than murder, apparently believing that she had genuinely thought her treatment would work even though it was negligent and caused death. On February 21, 1912, Judge John S. Yakey sentenced Hazzard to hard labor for 2 to 20 years at the Washington State Penitentiary, a relatively lenient sentence given the evidence that she had deliberately starved patients to death and stolen their property. Hazzard served only 2 years before being pardoned by Governor Ernest Lister on December 26, 1915, a decision that was controversial and remains unexplained, with some historians suggesting that Hazzard's husband had political connections that facilitated the pardon. After her release, Hazzard and her husband moved to New Zealand, where she continued to practice her fasting cure and reportedly saw several more patients die under her care, though she avoided prosecution there. In the 1920s, the Hazzards returned to Washington State and Hazzard actually resumed operating a sanitarium, this time called the School of Health, near Olalla despite her conviction. The fact that she was allowed to return to practice and continue endangering patients demonstrates failures in medical oversight and regulation during this period. On June 24, 1938, the sanitarium burned down under mysterious circumstances, and Linda Hazzard herself died in the fire at the age of 71, possibly from smoke inhalation or burns. The irony of her death was not lost on observers, as she had spent her life starving others and died in a fire at her own facility. Hazzard's case is significant as an early example of medical fraud and malpractice in alternative medicine, demonstrating how unproven treatments promoted by charismatic practitioners can cause severe harm and death, particularly when combined with financial exploitation. Her conviction was also notable as one of the few cases in the early 20th century where a practitioner of alternative medicine was held criminally responsible for patient deaths. The story of Linda Hazzard and her victims has been documented in books including Greg Olson's Starvation Heights and serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical practice, the vulnerability of patients seeking cures for chronic conditions, and the importance of skepticism toward practitioners who claim miraculous cures while isolating patients from outside support and scrutiny.